What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Dennis Poulette Show. So happy to have today on the podcast a guy by the name of Mark Oestreicher. He has been an influential mind in youth ministry for many, many years, and lately has been reading and researching a whole bunch about the amazing teenage brain. And so today it is a privilege to have him on the podcast. So I hope you enjoy this interview. So actually I've been thinking through this, and I'm kind of thinking through, like, how did you get into the topic of the teenage brain? Like, what was the first your first entryway into that?
Yeah, well, I spent, most of my youth ministry years, all of my youth ministry years have been with junior hires. The last 20, I've been leading organizations that train youth workers, but still, I've been a volunteer in the junior high ministry at my church for the last 21 years. And prior to that, I was a junior high pastor. And I think that junior hires are so unique. And
that's one way to put it.
Yep. And it's absolutely critical to understand them, right? So I've been doing this for 38 years. So I started early on reading about early adolescent development in order to better understand the kids in my ministry. And as my both affection for them and understanding of them grew, I just started to see more and more how critical it was to understand particularly some of the stuff that's happening in their brain development. So yeah, it's just become a subject that I'm really interested in. So I'm always reading new stuff and observing and all kinds of stuff like that.
Right. So I went to this Download Youth Ministry volunteer training thing, and I'll be honest, I was looking over the topics. I took some of my volunteers to it, looking over the topics, and I guarantee that the one that I was like the least interested in at all, no offense to you, was the teenage brain, because I thought this thing cannot be practical at all, because I've been around youth ministry for a long time, youth ministry training, like I'm doing a doctorate in family ministry, all this stuff that, like, I'm thinking, oh great, here we go, it's going to be like so irrelevant and impractical that like nobody's ever gonna want to watch this ever again, right? And so as you started going and talking about it, like, I was like, this is really practical stuff. This is stuff that doesn't just like, it's not just brainy stuff. It's not just academic stuff. It's really super practical. So
yeah, it totally impacts what I do in every aspect of ministry.
And so kind of what I wanted to do with this conversation is I want to get incredibly practical with it. Like, not just talking about how it's changing or anything, but like, what does that mean for us, right? Like, how does a parent change based on an understanding of the development of the brain? We know, I was reading one of the books that you wrote about the topic, about like, how can you, we know all of this physical development is happening, and then we kind of just forget about the brain development. And I have a 6th grader, and I have a 9th grader, and I have a 4th grader. So I need as much practical advice as anybody about what does this actually mean for me. So what would you say are some of the biggest things that you've learned in your study or your reading, and then like the things that have like really practically helped you either as a youth pastor or as a parent?
Yeah, probably the single most important thing to understand in terms of adolescent brain development is that it's all about the onset of abstract thinking. Okay, so the brain goes through a bunch of stages of development and how it understands and processes information, and the last of those significant changes comes with the onset of puberty. So young teens are brand new in this new stage, and older teenagers, high schoolers, are still working it out pretty significantly. Even 20-somethings are still working it out. So it's basically a shift from preteens and children being limited in their thinking to black and white and concrete ways. Whereas in early adolescence, we get this brand new ability to think abstractly. And that has a bunch of implications, but the two most important ones for parents and youth workers to understand is that it means we have this new ability to think about speculative ideas,
Okay.
right? To think about, for example, if I make this choice or this choice, what might the implications and down the road actions be from that, right? Or even to speculate about someone else and their decision-making process. That's not a cognitive capacity that children possess. And so it's brand new for young teens, and it's still being worked out for older teens.
So is that then like when you tell your kid your actions have consequences? Is that kind of what you're talking about? Like, if I do this, then this will happen, or if somebody else would have, or if I've got two choices that I have to make, it's harder for them to be able to choose one or the other. Is that what you're saying? Like speculating about, if I go this route, what's going to happen?
Right. I mean, it's almost impossible for preteens to do that. For example, they might have an assumption about what the consequences of their actions would be, but they would assume that they would assume it's reality, not a speculative idea. And they would also assume that everyone else would think the same way. So that's why, your fourth grader would be surprised when the consequences, let's say, or even just things that happen as a result of something else, right? Not even necessarily, could be positive consequences too. When they're not what they assumed they were going to be, that's a surprise to them. Whereas that becomes less so for teenagers now, who are able to start to speculate. And it's not only about decision making, realize it's speculate about all kinds of things, right? It's even speculate about who I am becoming, speculate about what is it my parents actually want from me. All of that kind of speculative work.
So like when we say you should have known better, their brain doesn't let them even really process that they should have known better.
I mean, I guess you could say with a preteen or a child, they should have known better if they have experienced that exact same thing, and parents have been really clear.
Right. And, so we have to make the effort of being extremely upfront with expectations and with consequences and what's going to happen, because it's harder for them to think through that, go down that hypothetical path.
Yeah. Now, with young teens, the interesting thing is they have this new ability to speculate, but it's like a brand new muscle they've been given by God as a puberty gift, but they're not good at it. They're really not good at it. It's like a really flabby muscle that has to be worked out for a number of years. So the capacity is there, but it's not very accessible to them. So they can go there, but they kind of need coaching. They need hand-holding. They need you as a parent to help them connect the dots, to look backward and see how those choices led to that, help them speculate. They can go there if we take them there. Right? So if they're thinking about, and again, this isn't just about decision-making about behaviors. It's so much broader than that. But to help them exercise that speculation muscle is really a big deal. In fact, it's a giant piece of faith development, right? So, I mean, the work you and I are in of being youth workers with teenagers, helping them exercise their speculation muscle is a critical part of faith development, because so much of what we end up believing as adults is worked out through speculation during our teenage and young adult years. Whereas when you're a child, it's much more, of course, as you know, much more of an inherited faith. I'm told this truth. It makes sense to me. I agree with it, right? But now we start to see teenagers have all these doubts and questions, which is, by the way, an absolutely essential part of faith development. But it all comes from that new ability to speculate. Let me quickly tell you what the other primary aspect of the onset of abstract thinking is. It's third person perspective. That means I can perceive myself from somebody else's point of view, or I can think about what somebody might perceive about you, or even an idea, right? That how somebody else might perceive that idea. That third person perspective is, again, not accessible. It's not something that preteens and children have. And junior hires just start to have that, but it's new for them. Here's a great way of thinking of it. If you put a fourth grade girl in front of a mirror and ask her to describe herself, she'll give you a very literal description of what she sees, combined with what people have told her about herself. But if you put a 16-year-old girl in front of a mirror and ask her to describe herself, you get a very different kind of description that is primarily built on her perception of other people's view of her, colored by some of those other things, what people have told her, things like that, right? So that third person perspective thing, it changes everything, right? Certainly giant implications for parent-teen relationships, because when you're in relationship with your third grader, they're not perceiving what you are thinking, right? Whereas your 14 or 16-year-old is perceiving that. They might be wrong, but they are actively perceiving it. Again, younger teens are really bad at this. The capacity is there, but they're just not very good at it. So they often misperceive.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. So they get better at perceiving what other people are thinking as they develop.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Okay. So you said something in the training that I thought was interesting, that I think goes along with what we're talking about, just as far as the way that we're thinking through this and maybe the impact that it makes on us. And one of the questions, I guess, that I had, the thing that you said was, let me see if I can find it. Do we perceive teenagers as a problem to be solved or a wonder to behold? Can you kind of explain what you mean by that? And then we can talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, it's broader than these developmental issues, that question, but it certainly is an important question when we're talking about these issues. I think that the majority of people in America, at least, in general, think of teenagers as a broken stage of life, like that they're dysfunctional. I would suggest that there's always historically been some of that, but for the last 100 years or so, that's been a dominant viewpoint of most people, that we think of teenagers as broken and that they need to come out of that at some point when they move into adulthood. But I would suggest that that's not God's perspective, that God sees them as a wonder to behold. And that has giant implications from when we're talking about things like these developmental realities. If this was God's creation intention, God's loving creation intention, then there must be a good reason for it. So let me give you an example of this. One of the parts of the brain that we know are significantly underdeveloped in teenagers, we've only known this for about 15 years since the invention of the MRI, is called the prefrontal cortex. It's the front part of your brain. It's the decision-making center of the brain. It's responsible for risk evaluation, impulse control, empathy, wisdom, decision-making, prioritization, a bunch of things like that. Those functions, those brain functions, are really difficult for teenagers because that part of their brain is underdeveloped. Now, if you view them as a problem to be solved, then you look at that underdevelopment of their prefrontal cortex and you think, they're broken, they're not capable of making decisions, they're dysfunctional, and so we need to protect them and isolate them and treat them like they were children, which is totally counterproductive to their growth and development.
That's kind of like when that came out, like a lot of that, all the memes on Facebook and everything was like, well, no wonder they can't do what we ask them to do, because they're horrible.
Exactly. Right, exactly. And I would say that's the dominant view of teenagers, even from people who actually like teenagers. The other perspective of that they're a wonder to behold, then you start saying, okay, why might God have made their brains to be like this at this stage of their life? And so, for example, on risk, right, their brains are not great at evaluating risk. The positive of that is that means they're really good at taking risks.
Right. Yeah.
And you and I are not, because we're risk averse because of a lifetime of trying, growing in our desire to avoid pain. Yeah. And so teenagers are great at taking risk, which of course can get them into all kinds of problems, but it also allows them to grow in their understanding of the world around them. And it also can be a great gift to our families and to our churches and our communities, because they're willing to try new things.
Yeah. And we probably have a generation of parents who are like, because we're afraid of taking risks, we don't want our kids to have to take risks because we don't want them to fail. And therefore, now we have all this helicopter parenting. We have all of this, like, I don't want Johnny to, get to lose a soccer game, so we're not going to keep score or whatever. All of that stuff is just like, we're no, let's not take risks. Let's pad our kids with bubble wrap and like let them go.
Right. Which I understand.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
the impulse, right? You want your kids to be happy and you don't want them to get hurt, right? However, it is counterproductive to their development into adults. And I would suggest parents consider, what's my goal as a parent? I would suggest a healthy goal would not be, I want them to be happy. Of course, I do want them to be happy, but that's not my ultimate goal. My goal as a parent, my kids, by the way, are 25 and 21. I want to raise adults. I don't want them to be stuck in adolescence.
I just tweeted that. I just tweeted your quote, I think.
Really? Beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, our goal is to help them become adults, and hopefully they arrive safely at adulthood, but with all of the things that they can do to actually be functioning adults. Yes. I mean, so it's that balance. It's a tension between being safe, but at the same time allowing them to exercise those muscles that they're developing in their brain as they are trying the speculative and as they're trying to, do all of those things, start thinking abstractly. That's something that you say in the book,
right?
Is, how can I as a parent help my kid start to think in these abstract terms that they've grown up not doing?
Let me give you a pragmatic, because you wanted to talk about pragmatic stuff. Pragmatic thing. Ask what if and why questions. Those are speculation questions.
Okay.
So if you're sitting around the dinner table and, your 14-year-old says, I'm thinking about running for student government. I'm just coming up with a random idea here, right? Ask what if and why questions to get them to speculate. That is helpful for the specific thing they're considering, but it also has a broader benefit of exercising their speculation muscle, so they'll get better at that for all areas of life.
Okay.
Don't always tell them what they should do.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Telling what they should do makes a little more sense if your kid is 9, because 9-year-olds are at the apex, the epitome of black and white thinking, right? And so, but with young teens and older teenagers too, we really want to help them with that speculation muscle. It's way better if they come to conclusions than if we just tell them the right answer.
Yeah. Yeah, good. That's good. There was another thing that you were talking about, and I don't know if I'm going to say it right, the Interior Cingulate. This was my favorite part of the entire thing, where you are dancing around telling us about this. And I thought that it's something that, like, for me, it like opened my eyes. So explain to us what that is and how that actually.
Yeah. First of all, it's the anterior cingulate.
Yeah. Spell check. It was autocorrect. I'm sure.
So anterior is, the opposite of posterior. So anterior means forward. That's all.
Gotcha.
That's all it means, right? The anterior cingulate is a part of the brain that's right behind the prefrontal cortex, and it acts as a mediator between the logical and rational thought of the prefrontal cortex and the fear center of your brain, which is called the amygdala, which is way back in the base of your brain, right above your spine. And all animals have the amygdala. It's what creates the fight or flight thing. Whereas only humans have a prefrontal cortex and have that logical and rational thought. But the amygdala, fear, and the prefrontal cortex, logic, they don't get along, and they override one another depending on which is stronger in a given moment, right? And the anterior cingulate moderates that. It works as like the fulcrum in the middle of a balance between the two. Now, what I talked about at the event that you're referencing is that neuroscience has recently discovered that which of those three parts of your brain are significantly more developed has a giant implication on your understanding and experience of God. So if you have a highly developed prefrontal cortex and you're a very logical and rational thinker, then you'll have a logical and rational faith that you can explain well, but probably lacks some heart. If you have allowed your amygdala to lead you into fear all the time, then you'll have a fear-based faith, which is probably going to be legalistic, trying to avoid the wrath of an angry God, right? But if you have a highly developed anterior cingulate, then it specifically is what allows you to understand and experience God as personal, compassionate, and other than yourself. Okay. Now, the really amazing discovery then is not just that, but how you grow your anterior cingulate. These secular neuroscientists discovered that the number one way to grow your anterior cingulate is through prayer and meditation. And the number two way is through worship singing. They call it spiritual singing. And so, yeah, I mean, it's prayer and meditation and worship on a daily basis, not a once a week basis. Going to church and praying, singing a worship song, I'm sure is wonderful and nice, but it doesn't do much for your anterior cingulate.
That's kind of like me and going to the gym once a week.
Yes,
I've been waiting for that to work, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, but a daily practice of those actually can grow even 10 minutes a day can grow your anterior cingulate by 50% within 2 months.
And is that like an individual, or is it corporate, or does it matter? Kind of a thing, like if your family is worshiping together or praying and doing those things together, does that count, I guess, is the question?
Sure. Yeah, good question. Sure. Yes, it does.
So as a parent, you could kind of encourage that.
As you're engaged. Yes. Yeah, it's one of the questions I've started asking youth workers. I mean, when I first was learning this, I was thinking, man, we as adults need to be putting this into practice, right? This weekend I was at an event with 100 middle school ministry workers, and I was talking about how this has to have implications for our leadership, that we will be more compassionate leaders and therefore more like Jesus in our leadership if we work to grow our anterior cingulates, right? So yes, it starts there, but then it's also begged this question for me is it seems like it should be one of our top priorities, whether a parent or a youth worker, when we're working with teenagers, is to help them develop those practices and those values in their life at this age. So it becomes part of who the practice even becomes part of who they are.
Yeah, and it's going to grow that part of the brain, which is going to grow their faith, hopefully, right? The way that they experience God, at least. Yeah, that seems to me like that should be a priority. And we've been talking about that for a while now, whenever it comes to family worship, family discipleship. What do parents do to kind of encourage that in their kids? And obviously, like, we're not all perfect at it, but it sure would be nice if we could figure out how to encourage that in our kids.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you think that we need to know for sure that we haven't covered?
I guess maybe I'll add one more part of the brain that's underdeveloped, because I talked about how the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, meaning decision making and stuff like that. So we need to help teenagers in that area. The other part that we've discovered is significantly underdeveloped is called the temporal lobes. It's on the side of your head, right above your ears. And that is responsible for emotional understanding and interpretation. So it's very challenging for teenagers to understand and interpret their own emotions, and even more so other people's emotions. And it's something that they have to grow in through practice again. Fascinating gender difference on this. Teenage girls are much more underdeveloped in that area than adults are, but teenage boys are exponentially more underdeveloped in that area. So if you have a junior high boy and he seems to just completely miss emotional cues, that's normal. Now, I'm not saying that we have to just suck it up and deal with it, but we need to more like think of ourselves as surrogate temporal lobes, right? We need to help our kids understand and interpret emotions, because it's often very difficult for them to do that on their own.
Okay. Yeah, especially probably in that 10, 11, 12 time frame, whenever there's a whole lot of junk happening.
Yeah.
So
that's right. Yeah.
So what can we do then? How do we do that?
Well, we help identify emotions. So through dialogue.
Okay.
Right.
So asking the right questions about how you feel. Like, is this empathy? Is this like, how would you feel if this happened?
Yeah. So I would start with normalizing their experience. So that means helping them understand that what they're going through is normal and good. It's part of God's loving design for them. Right. So that is, if your kid's experiencing some wild emotions and they're not even sure what they are, to have a conversation about, hey, I know it feels really wacky right now. Here's what's going on, right? I've had this conversation with my own kids, particularly when they were that age, multiple times. You're growing into adult experience of emotions. It's going to take a while to get used to them. It will become a wonderful resource for you to experience the fullness of life that Jesus promises us in John 10:10. But in the meantime, the process of getting there can be a little bit messy. So normalizing their experience is step one. And then the second would be that thing where I was kind of only slightly joking when I say being their surrogate temporal lobes. It's when they're experiencing an emotion or trying to seek someone else's emotion, is to come alongside them and process that. I'll give you a quick example. Sitting in my small group with a bunch of junior high boys, probably, I think they were 8th graders at the time. And one of them was expressing something very emotional that he wanted prayer for. But it was a conflicted emotion. Like, he was excited about seeing a brother that he hadn't seen for a couple of years, a literal blood brother of his. He was excited and afraid at the same time. And I could see that very easily. It was obvious to me. His best friend was totally missing it and was just popping off with some really stupid advice, right? And so I paused and I said to the friend, hey, I want to help you with this. I want you to look at your buddy's face, and what emotion do you think he has right now? And he didn't know. And so I said, here's what I think it is. And I asked the kid who was expressing the emotion, is that right? Are you experiencing some excitement, but also some fear about seeing your brother? And he was like, yeah, that's it. And now I'm helping this kid who missed it. Now, do you see that? And he's, oh yeah. Okay. Now I see it. See, so in the midst of that, I'm processing his emotions with him, helping to identify it. And then hopefully he can get better and better at that as he grows up more.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to do that in the moment. You're like, come on, man, you're missing it. You want to smack them upside the head and be like, you should have gotten that already. But to understand that they're not going to get it unless we help them see it is a super important thing to know. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me. I know that you've got plenty of other things to do, and you got a lot of.
I wrote a book about this stuff specifically for parents.
Yeah, that's the one that I was reading. What's it called?
I wrote 2 of them, actually. I wrote 2 of them for parents. One is specifically for parents of junior hires or middle schoolers. It's called Understanding Your Young Teen.
Okay.
And then I wrote one that's specifically about brains for parents. And it's a little tiny book, a very quick read called A Parent's Guide to Understanding Teenage Brains.
Yeah, that's the one I was reading this weekend. It takes like 2 hours if you want to process the whole thing. maybe less, but it's a good book. I'm going to go back and read it again and read it again. Yeah. So what are some other things, just maybe what are some other books besides the ones that you've written, like that maybe if somebody wants to like super really explore this, is there something else that we could get into?
Yeah. A lot of the books that I've written are a little more of a quick overview. There's a really excellent book that's also a Christian book for parents called Your Teenager Is Not Crazy that I have found really helpful. It's got a lot more of the it's got a lot more footnotes than mine does. Way. And then if you want to read about the anterior cingulate stuff, the book on that is called How God Changes Your Brain.
Okay.
It's not a Christian book, but really, really fascinating.
Yeah, that one sounds interesting for sure. Well, appreciate it. I know this is super helpful for me. Like I said, I was going into that part of the workshop going, oh boy, I'll watch because it's Marko and I want to see if anything falls out of his beard. But besides that, it was surprising to me. And I've been in this for a while. It's not like I have never been in youth ministry, but just being able to think through some of these things has been helpful. Hopefully it'll be helpful for me as a parent, number one, and then number two, as a youth pastor too. So
good stuff.
Thanks a bunch, man. Appreciate it.
Okay, Dennis.
I'll talk to you later.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining along today on this podcast episode. I hope you liked it. If you did, please make sure you leave it a rating, and we will talk to you on the next episode.